Start. We're all here, I guess. But I thought there are less people. Oh, don't just 8 people. Why? Where are all the other people? Doesn't matter. They will come back. Oh, maybe they're coming. Okay. So let's start again. We were saying that we have, in a way, it's again my proposal, but I divided this second part of the lectures, of the lecture, in two different approaches to the ground. We can consider, of course, these approaches a little bit arbitrary or merging one with each other, so it's not actually so schematic, the difference, but it can be didactically speaking useful in certain cases. So we will use these categories, these two approaches. Of course, I just tell you that we can, of course, think about it. We can disagree with this proposal. It's just an attempt to identify two different and sometimes superposing approaches to the ground in terms really of actually of landscape approach. So the first one that we're going to tackle through some examples, a collection of more recent examples, not only recent but also arriving to more recent examples, is this one that I called historiating the ground. What does it mean to historiate the ground? It means to invest the ground, so the surface, with a narrative, figurative content, something that is an historiation of the ground. So something that expresses exactly the nature of the plane by adding a decorative pattern to this plane. Could be something, as I said, figurative, could be something more narrative in the literary sense of the word. We will see of the word. We will see through the examples. So, in a very few words, the way I synthesized this approach is this: the illustration of a surface through the superimposition of a decorative pattern of signs or materials applied to the support without damaging its structure. So, all these operations that acts on the ground without modifying structurally its essence. The ground, in this case, is treated like a canvas, like the canvas of a painting, or like a music score, like the pages of a book. Imagine that the ground is something on which you can write upon, on which you can draw upon. Okay, something that can be invested by a narrative, decorative, figurative intervention. Let's go to see what I mean. There are, just to express a little bit more this idea, I added some photos that can be examples, informal, everyday examples of this attitude. Like the fact of the asphalt can be, for example, a perfect support for this kind of operation through the addition of color. Painting, for example, in here, this photo talks about a very close-up view of the surface of asphalt that is textured with these innards that make the surface, and at the same time it is enriched by the presence, maybe wanted or maybe unwanted, voluntary or involuntary, we don't know, of a certain drama, of a certain pattern. I just said it, but then I had pattern of color filaments, okay? Or on the other side, the insertion of very small elements that we can see sometimes in our streets, because asphalt, as you know, has this property of allowing us to introduce some element in the moment in which it is still not completely finalized. So, of course, this attitude can be traced back also to many traditional customs, habits of some people, like Indian people. For example, the kolam. I don't know if you are familiar with the kolam. Maybe there is some Indian, some students from India that maybe is at home. But anyway, if you're not familiar with this is a practice, this is a ritual practice that is very typical of certain regions of the south of India, Tamil Nadu or others. That the women especially used to trace with powder at the entrance of the houses in order to keep away evil or evil spirits or whatever. So it's a ceremonial habit that is used in order to propitiate. It's a propitiatory ritual. Then, of course, is renewed every single day, because its nature, its very nature, is to be completely ephemeral. These are geometric signs, geometric drawings that are superposed on the earth in the front of the doors of the houses, that are renewed by the women every day, because, of course, they are meant not to be there forever. So it's quite linked also to the practice of doing it, the ritual, the very act of doing is part of the propitiatory ritual, that is part of the habit of the kolam. Traditionally, there is a special connection between the kolam and the day of the week, season, phase of the moon, religious calendar. Each arrangement of the planets and disposition of the god is associated with a symbolic representation capable of uniting macrocosm and microcosm. So again, there is this idea of a trace on the surface that is connecting the mundane dimension, the earth dimension with the cosmic dimension. There is this symbolical connection between cosmic forces that is achieved thanks to the trace, to a symbolical trace on the ground. So this is a way of explaining this idea. Okay, this is a woman tracing the column in front of the door of the house in the earth. So these are very skilled and complex drawings that are meant to disappear a few hours after they've been completed. Another example that is still not authored, but something that is typical, that is part of the say, we can say, spontaneous, vernacular, anonymous tradition of certain places, is this typical use of the floor in some island in Greece. For example, this is Mykonos, in which there is this custom to trace these thick lines of rough white paint on the coat of cement, whose organic forms simulate the joints between imaginary irregular slabs of stone. So the function, the intention behind this habit, this custom, is to simulate a more expensive material in presence of a very, very rough and economic material. Okay, so but there is also this, let's say, this idea of decorating the ground, of superposing a figurative or a narrative pattern on the ground. Then, of course, this kind of attitude can be expressed in authorial terms, or in very interesting terms, by a certain tradition of landscape practice that can be considered in a way a sort of hedonist landscape tradition, to which we can ascribe the work of some of the landscape architects we already met during our path. For example, Burle Marx. Burle Marx is one of the great interpreters of this ancient tradition of historiating the ground, that we can see in many ancient examples. We saw as the way in which this drawing, that this pattern, this amoeboid, this rhythm, this pattern, serious pattern that is for example, it applies to several projects, such as the Parque do Flamengo in this case, but also to the famous Avenida Atlântica that we already saw, stems from the typical pattern of white and black Portuguese stone that was used in Portugal, in Lisbon, for example, and then was also used in Brazil, and that Burle Marx interpreted at a different scale in the promenade of Copacabana Beach. And this is a very typical way of, say, treating the ground. The very interesting element of the Avenida Atlântica, as we mentioned when we met it, when we dealt with Burle Marx works, is exactly this idea of transforming this transition between the sidewalks. The sidewalk that is meant as the transition between city and the ocean, in something that gives freedom to the walk, in something that is completely invested by a landscape treatment that transforms this transition into a sensory experience, in something that is, that gives shape to the experience of walking through it. And this shape of the experience is really achieved thanks to the rhythm of the drawing and to the rhythm of black and white Portuguese stone, arranged exactly in this shape. So,
inspired from pigeons in the discovery of the inspired from the pigeons.
The pigeon. Yeah. But do you know it because you read from?
Yeah, I read it because it's like after the second or third one. I just looked at some articles. He said that he inspired from pigeons. Also, the waves is from the beach of Copacabana.
Yeah.
That's why it's been inspired.
Okay, because of course we have to consider that this drawing was already present in the previous sidewalk at a completely different scale, and that is also there in Rocio, for example. So there are more ancient and traditional, examples of this drawing, and he readapts in a way to the use of the huge metropolis that Rio has become through the time. So. Yeah, I didn't know about it, but it's interesting that you read it. It can be something to think about. And anyway, what we are interested in is to try to, let's say, of course, identify this attitude to the ground that we may be that we can agree with, maybe, or maybe we are more akin to other kind of interventions of the ground, but that has been a very huge, strong, consolidated tradition from, say, traditional streets and pavements and sidewalks to contemporary, modern 20th century landscape practice, and that is still quite light. Now we will see some contemporary example. Okay, this is another. These are, let's say, images that you already know because I already showed you, and I want to just repropose this quotation that is very interesting in this proposal, in this short article that I gave you by Peter Walker and Ballarissimo on Burle Marx, Barragan, and Pushkin. It is very important, so really, this is very important for you to read it. Walker and Simo say that, as did Le Corbusier, Burle Marx places objects on a plane, not to glorify the object, but to express the plane itself. And however enriched with patterning and planting, the plane remains out, in tension. So the incredible skill of Burle Marx's drawing and shaping of the ground is exactly this idea of not to glorify the object, but to express the plane, to express the surface, to put in tension the surface through the elements. And so to express the best of its possibilities, the surface itself, if you know what I mean. Then, Safra, Root of Garden, of course, is one example. There are many, many examples. I just go fast on Burle Marx because we talked a lot about Burle Marx. Then, maybe you know this other hedonist, we can consider him another hedonist of landscape practice, active in the World War period, so in the 50s and the 60s and so on. There is Dimitris Spikionis. Have you heard about Dimitris Spikionis? Okay, so Dimitris Spikionis is one of the, let's say, heroes of Kenneth Frampton's as soon as he theorized the so-called critical regionalism. Maybe you have heard about this expression, critical regionalism. In case you didn't hear about it, Frampton meant by critical regionalism a sort of a new category in architecture, which was able, according to him, to overcome the universal character, international character of modernism. In a way, modernism showed some limit at a certain point, exactly because of this international character. That it is a very huge and difficult issue to be tackled in here. But of course, the attempt by Frampton was to place modernism locally, to define modernism in a local way, to affirm that modernism produced some architectural practice, architectural expression that was able to interpret local characters, specific local characters, site-specific characters. We talked about site-specific in art. We could talk about architecture. Of course, it's always site-specific because it is conceived for a certain site. But you know that the rays of the heroic years of modernism, the 20s, the 30s, the international style exhibition by Hitchcock and Johnson in 32, all this movement was supposed to be kind of universal, international, meant to be good everywhere, to be working in every place and in any place, in any climate, with arrangements and adaptations, but that there was a language that was able to interpret architecture in a universal. Of course, all of this was eventually utopian. Say we nowadays have dealt with the modernist historiography in a different way. We actually know that modernism wasn't so monolithic movement, such as it was maybe praised to be by certain historians and critiques that were, say, trying to affirm certain priorities and principles, etc., and ideas, etc. And so, let's say, all this deconstruction of the universalist-based idea of modernism comprehended, included this step of critical regionalism, this category of critical regionalism that Kenneth Frampton introduced in order to explain, to investigate these modernist practices that were able to interpret the site. So, Spikionis for him was exactly one example, a perfect example of this critical regionalism, something that was speaking in a very modern language, through very modern vocabulary, but also completely rooted in a certain site, in a certain place, in a certain culture. Of course, this brings, let's say, this involves all the discourse about tradition. It has been very, very difficult and delicate. Anyway, just to give you an insight about this. And the very major project by Dimitris Pikionis, that is his work of Capolavoro, his major work, is this path running around the Acropolis of Athens. And that is realized through the reuse of existing stones together with new stones. So an operation that wasn't exactly philological, but that mixed existing ancient materials with new materials, all merged together in this incredibly rich sensorial pattern, and developing through a path on the hill in front of the hill of the Acropolis. So in a way that through this path you can the visitor can experience different views of the Acropolis and discover the Acropolis on very different points of view. But at the same time, having, let's say, this very highly sensorial experience of walking on always different and always very rich arrangement of stones. Now I will show you. I will show you other images, but I think it's also interesting to compare this work of Dimitris Pikionis. Of course, he's a Greek architect and landscaper, to this famous painting by Paul Klee, because we have this idea of again of a pattern that is at the same time figurative and abstract. Let's say this. The title of this painting is interesting because it's called Main Street and Secondary Streets. So in a we have only sort of grid, irregular grid with different colors filled with different colors that creates different geometrical shapes filled with different colors. So it seems to be at the very first stance an abstract representation, something completely abstract, made of a game of geometrical and colored textures. But at the same time, if you look through it and if you read its title, you understand that there is the evocation of, there is something figurative, the idea of a perspective of a main street that loses itself into the, say, in a one point perspective, and of maybe fields or a sort of grid of organization of a territory, something that we can't say exactly what it is, but it is evoking the organization of the land, secondary streets that articulate the territory. So in a way, we have a similar attitude in Pikionis' project, and of course, also if Burle Marx took, say, inspiration from a certain tradition that was the tradition of the sidewalks of Portuguese white and black stone, of the great Portuguese tradition, of urban tradition, Pikionis took inspiration from the very archetype of the street, the Roman street, the stratification of the Roman street made with of the selciato. In Italian, it is called selciato, made of stone that are one next to that are organized, arranged one next to the other, and then create layers superposed to the ground, and that is the very archetype of the street. If you go, I don't know, to Pompeii, you can see it with your own eyes. In many places. So I show you some other images of this work that, as you see, have very different articulations according to the because it's a quite long path and it has very different drawings, patterns, articulations doing its different pieces and portions. And as I told you, in the main cases, it makes use of stones and elements and pieces of the streets already existing, ancient classical streets already existing there, and rearranged in a completely new way, in a completely contemporary way at the end of the day. Because of course, if the act of arranging the stone one next to the other is a very ancient one, the way in which he does it and the language in which he does it is completely contemporary, if you understand what I mean. See, the drawing that he creates is full of aesthetic intention, you know? So here we see one of the points in which it is the path on this Colle di Filopappo is called, this hill of Filopappo Hills in front of the Acropolis is opening in some areas, more wider areas that are meant to stop and to enjoy the view of the Acropolis, such as sort of really it's something that is in constant dialogue with the landscape around. And it has this idea of a geometrical pattern, but that contains some more recognizable elements, that contains elements of directionality or sometimes more abstract patterns. So really rich of aesthetical intention and of a very inaccurate choice, each stone and the arrangement of each stone. So more hedonist than this, it's difficult to find. Again, Carlo Scarpa is another one who can be included in this attitude, of course, because maybe you know, you have the possibility to experience in person some of his works. This is, for example, the Olivetti shop in Venice, but there are many of these examples. In this case, there is this idea again of re-enlivening an ancient tradition that is the tradition of the Venice, come si chiama? Segato di marmo, segato di pietra, typical of Venice, that is arranged in this abstract mosaic in which every single element has a slightly different color, and that creates a surface that is completely sensorial. It is completely bidimensional, but it has a very strong sensorial character. Or in the Fondazione Querini Stampali, I think that I guess that we are going to deal a little bit with Scarpa in the next lecture. More in particular, and in a specific relation to the use of water in his gardens and landscape projects. So this is the Querini Stampali. You see how the most important there are some points in the garden, in the exterior garden of the Fondazione Querini Stampaglia, in this internal patio, this internal garden, that are invested by a very rich and articulate and very careful decorative treatment in order to stress which are the points of major design effort and major intensity of the composition. There is a stress of intensity through some specific elements that are maybe in a different material, because these are in marble instead of in a different stone, or they are, of course, treated as sculptures in their own sake. Or another interesting example that stems a little bit also from some postmodern examples. I don't know if you guys know these examples. Miguel Ángel Roca is an interesting architect, Argentinian architect, and this is an example taken from his the because I am trying to show that example to my friend. Really? Pictures. I don't know where I found these pictures. Maybe from a book that I had. Yeah. There's a book on. Yeah, nobody's paying so much attention to look. I don't know why, because it's kind of cool. It's a very important architect, in my opinion. And yeah, but if you need the reference, I can make photo of my book and send them to you. Anyway, these are very interesting examples. I've been to Cordoba actually, and okay, we are talking about Argentina, Cordoba, not Spain, Cordoba, Spain, and there is this interesting, again, this idea of the anamorphosis. You see the projection of the main buildings on some of the squares in central Cordoba, in which there is this, not only the projection, but an anamorphosis projection that simulates a sort of shadow, a schematic shadow of the building over the public space. That is kind of interesting because it connotates the public space with the ludic character, and also there is this idea of, again, historiating the ground, of projecting a figurative dimension, pictorial dimension on the ground, on the very surface of the public space. Okay, these are two different examples. In this case, it's not exactly a projection of the building, but it's a geometric pattern that is creating a dialogue with the building. So the building and the public space are putting tension through this drawing, to the drawing of the public space. Here in this photo, you can see better in Plaza de Armas this idea. There is not the anamorphosis here, but there is only the projection of the building in a kind of different scale, I guess. I don't know if the scale, of course, is different, if you can see. But it's very interesting, and we are here in the 80s, of course. It's something that also Robert Venturi sometimes did in America. So it can be a little bit ascribed to a sort of a postmodern turn into also the more freer and more ludic treatment of public space, less rigid in a way. And this is a photo that is interesting because you see actually the effect of this experience that walking on the surface can mean. And another, this was a more figurative example. Now we have a more literary example. Literary, I don't mean that this literary identical or literary taken from something, but it deals with literature. Okay, so we have this example of Little Sparta. It's a very, very interesting landscape intervention by Ian Hamilton Finlay. Ian Hamilton Finlay is a landscaper, but he's also a poet. So he actually started his career as a poet. He's a living architect. Started his career as a poet, and then he actually started to apply his poetic work on landscape itself, and he did it in different works, but especially on his own garden. He bought a very huge factory in a piece of land in Scotland. Together with his wife, he rearranged his land over a long period of time, decades, and it is still still in progress. Now it can be visited as well by tourists if you go there. And he began to work to add to this domesticated landscape, because it's a very domesticated landscape that he domesticated more and more. He has this idea of landscape as something completely transformed by man, domesticated, something that has nothing to do with the wilderness, with nature itself. You know, he always talks about landscape as something that should be the result of civilization in a way. They say there's no landscape without civilization. So, and he's pushing a lot of this idea through his landscape interventions that are always dealing with literary quotation and the idea of a certain classical ideal civilization that contrasts much with the present. So in a way, he is a kind of nostalgic of a more human, utopian, ideal state of civilization that he considers to be completely lost in present days. So his work contains also a political, societal kind of component. And so, for example, I show you some of the small installations that he spread around this piece of territory that he acquired in which he set his own garden, private garden. This is a sentence of Saint Just, so many of the reference also stems from important political events of the past, in this case the French Revolution. And he took this sentence, the present order is the disorder of the future, and he inscribed like this with a very powerful font on the stones this sentence, and again we have say the presence of these natural elements with invested by a literary quotation. Or here, for example, and of course, also the interesting stuff is that you have it then separated and maybe decomposed in a kind of postmodern sense, so that can be read in a different way. So there are all these subtle contents in his works. But for example, this is of course homage to the great founders of landscape tradition, Poussin, Lorraine, we talked about them. So it says, "Si Poussin, here Lorraine." So you are, when you visit the place, I've never been there anyway, I can imagine when you visit the place, you are when you stroll from this garden, you are moved to, encouraged to stop in certain very significant, meaningful sites and to think about the relationship between man and nature. Of course, all these elements are artistic reflections on the very essence of the relationship of man with nature. By evoking Poussin and Lorraine, the sort of lost ideal tradition of this classical antiquity that Poussin and Lorraine also strive for, etc. Or other images, for example, the other examples. We are always in Little Sparta, okay? So we have these small paths that are leading to the basis of the trees, giving meaning to each specific natural presence in the place, with inscriptions and with super interpretation of the natural landscape. So the natural landscape is nothing by itself. It needs to be super interpreted, over-interpreted by the work of art, if you know what I mean, etc. Or, for example, elements, fragments of columns that are evoking this lost cultural, say, classical civilization that are always talking about, let's say, this metaphoric condition of landscape as something that is with civilization. This is always Little Sparta. The column? In Scotland. This is in Scotland. I don't know exactly which part of Scotland. I don't remember, but it's in Scotland. Let me check if I wrote something about, no, It's in some place in Scotland. Okay, or of course, more contemporary cases. So now we enter into nowadays practice. It's a collection. Peter Walker. Peter Walker is the one who wrote this essay together with Melanie Simon, this essay about Burle Marx, Fouché, and Barragan that you're going to read. But he's especially and mainly a landscape designer who had, together with others, Martha Schwarz or Hargreaves or other names that were landscape architects that were active through the 80s and 90s. Some of them are still active nowadays. Bring, in a way, into landscape practice the influence of artistic practice, land art, minimalist art. Peter Walker, especially minimalist art. He looked a lot to Robert Morris, to Donald Judd, to Solowit. Many people pronounce it Solowit, but I think that Solowit is the right way to pronounce it. Anyway, it doesn't matter. And etc. So he brought together with other landscape architects, and especially with Martha Schwarz, has been, I guess, also his associate for a while. I think so. They brought, say, some of the instruments. They merged the instruments of minimalist art and landscape into everyday practice of landscape architecture, and dealing with a lot of public spaces in the not only American but also European urban spaces. This is Berlin, the Sony Center Plaza, but we have many examples also in America. I'm sorry, I didn't put the caption in here, and I don't remember what it is. Anyway, this is also an interesting example of how a texture, in this case of an abstract pattern of light, can create actually the space and make the public space a place in a way, something that you can interact with, something on which you could experience a certain excitement in walking on it, etc. So, of course, this is typical of minimalism. He saw Carl Andre, etc. Martha Schwarz, we are in Cambridge. Again, these kind of practices of having interruption, solutions of continuity into the display of the surface, like for example with mirrors, is typical of, I don't know, Lafure Eliasson, Donald Judd, other artists. And she uses it in interventions of landscape architecture, such as in the arrangement of this square, of this campus square in the Mid campus in Cambridge, the MIT campus in Cambridge. So we are again in the 70s, beginning of the 80s. Or together with Peter Walker, again in the MIT campus, we have this game, this superposition of two different grids. That is also, the grid is another typical category of modernist art sculpture that Rosalind Krauss have described in another famous essay we have talked about grids as another typical category of modernism. Anyway, more recent examples of this attitude of historiating the ground can be found maybe in Maledrio. I don't know if you ever saw this intervention that was developed at the beginning of the 2000s. I showed you maybe in the landscape architecture, landscape urbanism lecture, just very fastly, by Rio Arquitectos, that is a Madrid-based firm, and Westat, which is a very famous landscape-based firm of Netherlands, based in the Netherlands. And that has been working a lot in the last few decades also in the United States. Governor's Island was a project won by them, etc. Anyway, you can see that West Act is here kind of playing with this decorative attitude of the public space. You see these huge surfaces of pavement are treated with this decorative pattern of flowers at a big scale that are surely, say, evoking in a way the Marxist tradition that also stems from an ancient tradition and so on. So they play with different textures, the grass ones, the paved ones, artificial and natural elements and materials that are together creating a very rich and articulated surface. Here we see an image from the top in which we understand this attitude. Of course, here we are not talking about let's say a very minimalist attitude toward the ground, but something more decorative, maybe superficial, something which is kind of really working on a superposition of the drawing, the texture. And in a different way, more geometrical but similar, Caruso St. John created the Stortorget Square in Kalmar. Near Copenhagen, if I'm not wrong, always the beginning of 2000s, in which we have this, you see this association of different gravel or more bigger stones or square stones cut in a different way, arranged in a different way, in order to create different textures and sensations of the square. So a very big urban space is qualified by the presence of this landscape treatment of the pavement. Imagine the importance. Maybe sometimes we just underestimate the importance of the ground in our cities, in the place that we live in. Imagine the importance that it has on your perception. Imagine that when you're experiencing the places, you're always walking. Let's say you don't eventually experience the places from I don't know, the top of an elevated mean of transportation. Usually, a pedestrian is experiencing the ground and is I don't know, not only in terms of maybe you don't like to meet some architectural barriers or something like that, but the quality of the ground is very important in our experience of our cities, of public spaces, of open spaces, whatever. This is an example that has been kind of classical now. It is an example in Sicily. This architect Marco Navarra, maybe you know him because he came in Piacenza for a previous summer school, I guess. Anyway, this is Sicily. That is a linear park between Caltagirone and Piazza Armerina. And this is a sort of bicycle path that is crossing several portions of landscape and that is really playing on this colored surface of the asphalt, the cement that is actually responding to the rhythm of the bicycle and also to the changes of the landscape around. Or Topotec, there is not the caption, I'm sorry, but this is an example. I think it's in Copenhagen or around there. This is a film that is called Topotec One, which is working a lot in this kind of asphalt surfaces treated with color and with geometric, not only geometric patterns, but sometimes abstract, sometimes more figurative patterns. And that is, say, they're not the only one to do them, but they have very beautiful examples of this, and they began very early to do it. So they can be just mentioned as a sort of emblematic example of this kind of treatment. This is also Topotec. So squares, public squares, or sport fields, or playgrounds, etc., are the subject of this. Okay, this is an urban square. You see how, of course, this is can seem to be very simple and superficial, but of course it's a way. Again, Topotec. etc. So now I introduce the other approach. Maybe we can go a little bit faster on this. That is a little bit different, because I wanted to stress the difference between this more superficial kind of historiating operation and another operation that really comes much more from land art and minimalist art, that is excavation and superimposition. Let's say, instead of expressing the plane and putting tension, the surface itself, we are here exploring its stratified nature, the stratification of the soil. We are here trying to act on the structure of the soil by attempting to its integrity in a way. So modifying the ground through more or less reversible acts of violation of its integrity, acting on its structure. So while in the first collection of examples, the soil was treated, you remember I said, as the surface of a canvas or the pages of a book, something which you can write upon. Here, the soil is treated as a sort of three-dimensional spatial structure, something that you can intervene as a spatial structure itself. So which are the operations involved? Carving, cutting, removal of displacement of material, uncovering of lower layers, addition of new layers and levels of meaning, introduction of material or conceptual boundaries, etc. As you see, of course, there can be superposition between the two things, two approaches. Of course, when you put a painting on a surface, you are adding a layer in a way. But of course, there is I'm kind of arguing that there is a difference of intention in the two things. One is more hedonist, and the other is more acting on the structure of the soil. You know? So let's see how. If before we saw painting introduced into the very surface of the asphalt, here we see the effect that erosion of asphalt can have. So there is a sort of when something like that is happening, you can feel that beneath the asphalt there is another stratification of soil that is kind of emerging, and that is maybe, for example, in this case, just the grass that is emerging beyond the asphalt when the asphalt is creeping, when there is an interruption, maybe a voluntary, on the surface from which something else can emerge. Conceptually, we have a different kind of operation. So again, I recall Deleuze and Guattari in Mille Plateaux, which they theorized about the modes of occupation of nomadic space, and they had in mind a field made up of small actions of contact and open to multiplicity, conceived to be experienced from inside rather than observed from a distance, following a reasoning course like that of cracks in asphalt. Okay, so this is a kind of metaphor. I will give this small article that I wrote that maybe can help you to explain this, maybe sometimes a little bit difficult concepts, but the idea of this rhizomatic structure that somehow is a metaphor of this nomadic space that Deleuze and Guattari had theorized. So let's go to see how this attitude can stem from minimalism. This is a typical example of minimalist art. Of course, this is very recent, but Carl Andre is dealing with this kind of research since the 60s, 70s. He is always dealing with this kind of idea of the stratifications of the soil. So, for example, in this case, we have a paved room that has cuts, directional cuts that are talking about the fact that this pavement is not a surface, but is a structure made of multiple stratas of different stratifications. So it's not only a plane; it's a three-dimensional thing. Or sometimes okay, there are many examples. In this case, maybe it's more expressing the plane, but of course there is always the idea of something that is superposed to something else, of different materials that are created. It is creating different space experiences. In this case, we have a square of copper slabs, and here a cross that is interpreting the space in a kind of incongruous way and changing the perception of the space completely, the directionality of the space completely. Or here in this case, we have a structure that is actually giving value or strengthening the directionality of the space. So in this case, it is working in together, but also in contrast with the vocation of the space. In this case, it is strengthening the vocation of the spatiality of this enfilade of galleries. Or, of course, the idea of Carl Andres has been always the idea of creating a sort of awareness of how the feeling of walking over different surfaces is also changing the feeling of the space itself, actually. He says that there are a number of properties that I can't read, that materials have, which are conveyed by walking on them. There are things like the sound of a piece of wood and its sense of friction. He talks about this sense of friction. I even believe that you can get a sense of mass, although this may be nothing but a superstition I have. So he talks about, of course, maybe a gallerist would tell to you not to walk over them, but the idea is actually that you should walk on them and experience a different sense of space according to the surface on which you're walking. And this is landscape, actually. Okay, so Doris Salcedo is another artist that sometimes deals with this kind of thing, but also with a more political connotation. Maybe one of her famous work that you may know is the Shibboleth installation in the Tate Modern in London in 2007 and 8, in which in the Great Turbine Hall refurbished by Herzog and de Meuron, transformed by Herzog and de Meuron in the Tate Gallery in London, there has been she introduced this creep in the pavement that was full of conceptual implications, because it in a way talked about the interruption of a continuity of something that is normally considered to be continue, something that say it's like a creep not only in the pavement but also in our certainties. Let's say we have normally the pavement is something continuous that you can walk and that is always supporting you. And suddenly, in the pavement of the Turbine Hall, a great creep is denying, this continuity, and is adding a sort of abyss, potential dimension, obscure and unknown dimension into spatiality, into the spatiality of this interior. And it's interesting that people actually are encouraged to go to look at this creep, to look at to cross sometimes this creep, or maybe to look into it, and maybe they are in a way embarrassed to cross it, or they feel like embarrassed is not the word, but it doesn't count. The real word. Anyway, you have this idea that is a sort of something that is talking about a deeper strata that is not visible, that usually shouldn't be visible, and then is made visible by the work. You know? And this brings us back actually to some of the works by Noguchi. As I told, we would have introduced this figure. It is quite important as much as Burle Marx. I decided not to devote a single lecture to Noguchi. Maybe I could have done, but anyway, of course we couldn't do everything in the course because we don't have time to make everything. Anyway, Noguchi is very important, and he's also one of the great figures of landscape architecture that are in this terrain of belonging in the midst between art, sculpture, and landscape, because he actually is a sculptor, and as a sculptor he created a lot of landscape projects, such as one of the most famous ones is this California scenario. We are in Orange County, California, and this tells you a lot about Noguchi's attitude towards landscape, because as you see, there is this idea in which there is not a prevalence of natural elements in these landscapes. There is actually a prevalence of artificial mineral landscapes. There are mineral landscapes mostly, but in these mineral landscapes, sometimes there are eventually some natural elements emerging that are acquired strong symbolical, metaphorical meaning as metaphors, essences of nature itself, like this mound punctuated with succulent and cactuses, plants, or this great, say, canyon, this artificial canyon, or the lands where water emerge through this pavement, pavement in irregular stone that is kind of evoking the regularity of a real canyon. So there is this artificiality that is always conceptually evoking something natural, but it is not. And this is very interesting in all of Noguchi's creations, landscape creations. Of course, because his attitude as a sculptor to the materials is an attitude that actually manipulates much more mineral materials. Or in this case, we are in the Chase Manhattan Plaza in New York. So it's not a public space that you can actually walk on. It is a public space that you are meant to look at from the top. And it merges, of course, this is always the basis of Noguchi's approach, to merge the two cultures, the Western and the Oriental cultures, that are merging his personality as well, because he had an American mother and Japanese father. He was split between these two cultures, and he wanted actually to bring this connection between the two cultures in his work. So his attempt, of course, you can see here the influence, a very strong influence of the Zen, the Japanese garden, of course, with more mineral elements and very intense specific points of contemplation. Or in this case, for example, we have more sculpture than a landscape piece, but the attitude is kind of similar when he's dealing with sculpture and in the proper sense, and when he's dealing with landscape projects. So you can understand what the discourse that we were doing at the beginning, in which there was this merging and crossing of the boundaries between the disciplines. This is another garden by Noguchi. See the simple, it's the simplicity of this garden. It's only say a surface arranged with these long slabs of stones with different textures, with different kind of material finish, come si dice? Finitura, texture. This huge stone that is there already, and the marking of a place again, but with this, always with this idea that more than creating a surface is exploring the stratified nature of the soil itself. And of course, the famous work on art and a landscape in the Sicilian landscape near Gibellino. This was the ancient site of the town of Gibellina, destroyed by a very violent earthquake in the 60s, and that was occupied by this land art intervention by Alberto Burri that is called Cretto. Alberto Burri has always dealt with the Cretto also in the scale of the painting, but in this case the Cretto is the scale of the landscape itself. So what did he do? He collected the debris of the actual town, and he evoked through these great slabs of concrete the shape, not actually the real morphology of the previous of the former town, but he evoked this medieval fabric of a small Sicilian town that actually didn't exist anymore because it was completely destroyed by the earthquake. So it's a very long, complicated story because the town of Gibellina was reconstructed in another site, not so near to the previous one, and this kind of memorial at the landscape scale took the place of the actual former town. Sorry? Paved. Yeah, but it's not only paved. It's like that. Maybe I can show you. Because I only put an image, but just to make you understand. You can move through it. It was actually also finished in the past few years after the Buddhist death. So you can move through it. It's a labyrinth, kind of.
So it's supposed to be like a memorial?
It's supposed to be a memorial. It's supposed to be talking about the presence of the former town, and it's supposed to be also a contribution of land art. We can kind of defining it as land art maybe, but of course at the scale of the landscape. So of course there is also, I guess that you can see as happens in these cases, you can see many things in the work. In a way, you can see these slabs of concrete are also meant to encapsulate the debris of the town. They are meant to evoke this sort of medieval fabric, but according to me, they're also talking a lot about landscape, because of course we are in a very arid region of inner region of Sicily, Belice, and this harshness of the landscape is kind of expressed by this idea of something that is creeped by the sun, creeped by something like the Creti, natural Creti, like when a piece of earth, arid piece of earth is creeped because it doesn't have water. So for me, it also evokes this kind of landscape. Here you see it green, but it's kind of harsh, this landscape.
Yeah, from the ecological point of view, I think it's really hard. In this huge sculpture in land.
It's really harsh, of course, but it was much criticized.
Yeah.
I said it has received a lot of critiques because, of course, if you see it from a certain point of view, it is a big, huge slab of concrete over the landscape. So it has environmentalists or ecologists have said this stuff. Anyway, of course, I think that it has a power that is on one side linked to the tragedy of destruction of not only one town, because all the small towns of the parish have been destroyed by the earthquake. But in this case, Gibellina was substituted by this work, and the town was reconstructed in another place. For example, the town of Poggioreale is still there in ruins. And so it's a ghost city that you can move in, but it's completely it's completely destroyed. So you move in between these destroyed buildings and like in a ghost city. So yeah, it is a say talks about this tragedy of the whole village, and at the same time, it is powerfully inserted in the landscape of the place. Then, of course, you can have different opinions on this, but I think it's a good example of this attitude of stratification. Another, let me check the hour. Okay, it's not so early, so we have to close. Another example that is interesting, it's an installation that has been made by Bruce Nauman, that is who is an artist, one of the artists that made part of this earthwork movement, and that was called to create and work for Münster, for the public space in Münster that was really called Square Depression, that consisted actually in this square surface, paved surface that is that creates this depression toward the middle of the space. So of course it's an art piece, it's an artwork, but it also it's interesting for us because it changes the perception of the space. Because of course, if you are in the middle, you perceive the landscape around cutting it only from a certain point onwards, and you feel like isolated, to be isolated in a more intimate space. So it creates a sort of different experience of the space through this depression, paved depression. Again, there is again the discourse that we were doing at the beginning, delimiting, paving. In this case, there is not tracing, but it's delimiting and paving and pressing. I don't know how to say it. Changing the land. And again, this stratification is also something that has been used by many landscape practices, landscape firms or landscape architects recently as well. This sort of, we talked already about it, this sort of play, these, how to say, two stratas that are contesting the surface. The vegetal one and the mineral one. That is the formal principle of the highland. It's really the formal principle that Dylan Scofidio and Corda used to create the park, because the park is kind of completely conceived over this idea of the disrelation of something that used to be there. That of course is not exactly what used to be there, because what used to be there you can see in the Joy Starford's photos, and is something completely different. But the new vegetation evokes in a way, and the evocation of the railways that were present on the highland. So the railways that are also a stratification over the layers. So past and a former layer and the new layer that are present, co-present, that are intertwined and dialoguing one with each other. The past, present, with different layers of time as well, not only of surface, but also of time. As if you depict and you can see the surface of the previous city, the city that used to be. So this is very, very strong, very powerful and intense in the highland, I think. Okay, so you can see it better in here. The formal principle of these elements that are actually also really playing on this idea. Okay. Formal principles that then say involves all the elements, all the furniture, for example, the benches that are also conceived according to the same principle of strips. Or Michel de Vigne Keio University in Tokyo, the terrace of the Keio University in Tokyo. Again, there is this idea. Maybe we already talked about it in the French, in the lecture on French landscape, on French practices, French contribution to landscape architecture. Anyway, as I mentioned in that occasion, Michel Debing is always using and working with this idea of say of rhythms, of patterns, and also of stratas. So there is this idea that the pavement is continuously, say, interrupted in its continuity by these holes, by the presence of this pattern of holes that are creating a sort of they are enabling to read the grid of the pavement, and they are joking, playing with this idea of the grid and with the different rhythms of this grid. And from these holes, from these interruptions of the continuity of the soil, is where the vegetation is emerging and dialoguing with the mineral surface. So there is this, again, like in the highlight, maybe it's not the past, because we are not dealing here with the previous condition, but we are dealing with the condition that is beneath the surface, the mineral surface. You can see the same project from a more detached view, and you can understand the way in which, say, the vegetation is creating different effects, always based on this principle, on the same very principle, like with more, with bigger trees and with just spots of grass, or sometimes also mineral elements are coming out of these holes. So there is this as we saw in Peter Walker and Martha Swartz, there is again the idea of minimalist art. Maybe I didn't put any example apart from Carl Andre, but maybe I could have put some Donald Judd stuff or Solowit. Anyway, there is this idea of the grid and of the different declinations of the grid. And this is another project that is also in a different way playing on this principle, and this is always Michel Debing, but we are in Luxembourg in the Park Braille Eckeln. And of course, Mosmark, we already saw it. So I just want to close with this, but since we already talked about this project, I just show you the images in the light of what we are mentioning now. And you can be completely, let's say, able to interpret them on your own, because we commented a lot of this. It's kind of come si dice, emblematic, the way in which these two surfaces are contending the park. There is a sort of, there is this cement that is talking about more architectural situation in the vicinity of the museum, and gradually leaves more space to the vegetal, to the earth and to the vegetal real. But of course, you can't actually distinguish which one is the wind and which one is taking over the ladder, or which one is prevailing. They are just two stratas that are explaining this principle of the stratifications of the soil, and the fact that every act, every intervention, every operation of pavement is something that says. I guess it's talking about also time, although it is not conceived to change so much. It changes in time because vegetation grows, but the cement is dead. It's becoming, is always staying there, and it's not changing. But of course, it's talking about the fact that every operational payment that you do is a trace that you leave, and this trace can be more or less ephemeral, again, as we said at the beginning. So you see how, say, the realm of what it used to be called as culture, that was in Krauss called as constructed site, marked sites, or site construction, and this complex ensemble of architecture, landscape, and sculpture, etc., merge one with each other, not distinguishable anymore one with each other. You can't really understand or conceive or interpret contemporary landscape architecture without considering the influence that art, minimalism, and land art has had on its instruments and its very practices, and the merging of these two things, this erosion of the borders between the disciplines is very important to understand contemporary practices in landscape architecture. And photos that you already saw, and that I'll just show you again in light of these discourses that we made, just to show you how, again, I tried in this lecture to organize and say these two poles that are, of course, can be considered as intertwined one with the other, superposed. They can superpose one to the other, so they're not so much separated and distinguished as it may seem. And to say that these attitudes have been present since the great tradition of modern landscape, and that, again, it's also taking inspiration, driving inspiration from more ancient sources, and that nowadays are still very, very strong, are still very, very live. So we saw examples of contemporary landscape interventions in both the approaches, like Madrid or St. John or Boston and Medellin, etc. for this one. So they are pretty alive. Both of them are pretty alive, and maybe can be useful to interpret landscape interventions. So this is all for today, and of course now we have time for your comments or questions about the bibliography. I want to show you, let's say, okay, what I ask you to read that I consider mandatory is these three things. My article is really short. It's like 2 pages, Italian and English, so 1 page actually. And it's just, you can consider it a synthesis of this lecture, a very, very compressed synthesis of this lecture. Then there is this small essay by John Bursley that is dedicated to earthworks on this book, from which I already extrapolated some bibliography, The Nature Visions, Landscape and Culture in the 20th Century, and it is called Earthwork, the Landscape After Modernism. I will send it in with people and leave in the copy center. And Rosalind Krauss, I don't know. So guys, it's a difficult test. It's very important, but it's actually really challenging for everybody, not only for you, also for me, for everybody. So I put it in the mandatory because I would like you to try to read it. But if you let's say, find some, say, obstacles, it's completely normal, you know? So really consider it completely normal to have some say struggling while reading, and some struggle while reading. And of course, maybe I'm very happy if you grasp what we said in the lecture, if you grasp the main concepts. I don't want you to grasp, let's say, the whole articulation of this course, of the argument that she does, because it's also quite located into art critique for being okay. So Rosalind Krauss, okay, but take it easy, okay. And the other two are mandatory, actually mandatory. And the other ones are only advices. Because you're interested, there are other things that you can willing to read. And for example, these two the phenomenon of place, of course, is that, as I mentioned, that we talked about in the beginning. I also left it in the copy center because I had it there and it was very easy to print it. So when you go there, remember that this is not mandatory. And there are these two books that are interesting because you're interested in land art and encroaching with landscape architecture. This is Udo Weilacher's very important book. It's called Between Landscape Architecture and Land Art. It is talking about some specific authors, Ian Newton Finlay, others. And this is the book, the companion book on land environmental art. It is published by Tidal. Maybe it could be considered, say, a very exhaustive book on the topic, but there are plenty of books on the topic, of course. So that's it. So now if you got, I'm recording, right? Yeah. Now if you got some comments or questions, you are welcome to do them. Or else.
I'm trying to organize in my mind. Because this lecture is quite interesting. It's about all these pressures around to say that the pedestrian experience the space in this scale, and we are used to see from the upper scale usually this approach. Also makes me a little bit something that I work in. This is for my bachelor about the approach of the Bottom Havana urbanism. Bottom Havana,
Tactical urbanism or something.
Because there are some points at the beginning where we were showing these interventions in the garden, sometimes I did an intervention about it, and this is like regulated with this practical urbanism. Some ways
I guess so.
Some interventions change the feeling and the way that space.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
And just maybe that sometimes here in the studios we are too much focused in the bigger scale, and it's the traditional approach from the up to down.
Yeah, of course.
And sometimes we forget or we don't have these little details that are actually the experience that you put in the space, walk, to see.
I completely agree.
Rich finance is we are taking care of many things in the other scales, and you finally reach this.
Yeah.
So you don't have time of things or
I don't think it's a question of time. I think it's really a question of approach, as you said, an issue of approach. I say, of course, you could dedicate the studio only to this kind of to the control and to the study investigation on the surface of a project of a tiny scale, maybe, if you like. But of course, it's a matter of approach. It's not a matter of time, because of course you could have to do it. The problem is that maybe we don't consider it so important in a university path, because we are kind of occupied and focused, as you said, on controlling the big scale, on controlling the relationship between scales, and maybe not so much yet on the quality of the material, of the sensorial quality. And we also are very much linked to vision. So we were talking from the beginning, and we mentioned many times in the course, and in the beginning we were talking about how this idea of vertical axis and horizontal axis is also interesting, because it questions, in a way, the dominance of vision, the hegemony of vision. And maybe the approach that you are talking about is linked to this hegemony of vision. Say we are when we are dealing with projects, especially in the university, because then in the real world it's a little bit different. You always have to deal with this when you are making a public project, a square, whatever. It's the first thing, you know. In architecture, we are maybe more used to deal with the materials because, say, maybe we have some paths. Say we have to work a little bit more on this. But you can tell me much more than how I can tell you according to your experiences in the studios, because say I have the idea of the thesis, because seeing the thesis I know what we used to do, but of course I'm not teaching a studio, so it's kind of difficult for me to have a real vision on this. But I guess that we are much more linked to this idea, to this visual conception of landscape, and so also with formal and environmental issues that sometimes forget the minute scale of the material, the sensorial quality of the material. That is very, very important. Of course, it's something that you don't realize. The project that you do in the university, you don't realize it. So it's something that is more maybe difficult to talk about. But I think that it would be worth it to dedicate some more space to this. For example, in some last courses, I did some experimental practical work with photography, and much of this was dedicated to, it was not a projectual design exercise. The exercise was to detect these qualities into the environment around you. So each one of the students chose subjects and had to make photographs that expressed these qualities, tactile qualities, color, texture, tactile qualities, etc. And so this was an experiment I tried, but it was nice actually. But yeah, maybe you're right to say that it is a little bit lacking. And as I said, it is not only in our studios, in our universities, maybe in our habit of perception it is lacking, I guess. Say, I would praise for everybody of us a major attention, more attention to these details in our everyday lives, you know what I mean? Let's say you developed your capacity of observation, and so consequently your capacity to eventually deal with these elements in terms of design. As much as you pay attention to these kind of details in your everyday lives, in your environments, and maybe sometimes we don't do it enough. We don't pay enough attention to these kind of things. We give from granted the pavement on which we walk, but maybe we shouldn't, because it's kind of very important. It's very important. And then the things you said about tactic urbanism. Okay, I'm not an expert of tactic urbanism. And of course, I think that it's very much linked to what we said, because it's an approach which tends to privilege the experience of the space, the perception of the space, the interaction with the space of the people at the small scale. And in this sense, I guess that what I think that landscape architecture and these practices like tactic urbanism are charged with is a great responsibility to fill the void of a common cultural idea of what public space should be. Say, we lost the ceremonial aspects of public space that we saw for, I don't know, ancestral people or children. We don't have anymore a sort of shared culture of public space in ceremonial terms. We lost it. We have some struggle in finding this shared culture of public space. So that's why landscape treatment of public spaces is charged with a great responsibility, because it's so it's thanks to its qualities, shape, texture, pattern, capacity to involve action, people gathering, to make things happen. That it depends everything. It depends on this instrument, you know. Everything depends on this instrument, because it is very easy when there is an agora and let's see it and everybody goes there and the political life of the city is there. I'm making a stupid example just to understand, to make you understand. It's very easy when there is a shared culture of public space that is kind of recognized, consolidated, and you have the places for gathering in which eventually this is really happening, etc. While you don't have it, everything is on the shoulders of a landscape treatment that should eventually encourage a certain behavior. And this is difficult because we will see in the next few lectures, in the final one maybe, I would like to introduce also the figure of Lawrence Halprin and the idea of movement in space and choreography. And for him, for example, he had a very strong belief in the idea that a certain shape or design of the space would eventually encourage a certain behavior. Okay, this is maybe not so direct. This is maybe not so deterministic. There is plenty of indeterminacy in public spaces, in how we would eventually react to them. So, of course, we say that there are a lot of interesting experimentations in applying, for example, art practices to public space in order to make it richer, more inviting, more encouraging, more interactive, more whatever. Public art is actually this: create interactive relationship with the city, with the environment in public spaces. We saw, the Anish Kapoor sculpture in Chicago was meant for this. So this encroachment of art or natural fluxes, the presence of water, is all meant to make the most out of public space in terms of eventual positive behaviors that this could trigger, but it's not so deterministic, so it's very difficult. So also tactic, urbanism, I don't know, I would need a little bit more of reflection and investigation to say if I have belief, I trust in these practices or not. What was your intervention about?
The work that I did was the development methodology, because I was at the starting of my thesis, I started with an hour. I used to do recover a river and all the area around, the great river with the city. And talking with my professor, I started to reflect about this type of interventions and start to find other different types of intervention until I learned from my project in a methodology how to intervene space for every perspective. So that was when I started to be involved, because this topics about urbanism, and I tried to develop methodology how to interpret I applied in the workshop of my university in a street that was mainly pedestrian. Pedestrian, I mean, it was for cars, it's for cars, but it's mainly used by pedestrians.
Yeah.
So we done some information trying to move the people in floor, they feel this more like
Mhm. Yeah.
The space dimensions.
Nice. No, but I think that it can really be powerful. It can be a really powerful instrument. There are cases of, because of course you can also start from very small things and actually do also after COVID, there have been a lot of examples of maybe streets that have been transformed, and maybe sometimes there has been a huge work of on come si chiamano gli spazi traffico, on these areas that are meant to separate one to the other, and maybe sometimes they've been transformed into more livable space. These interstitial in between spaces that are underused in the city, sometimes these gaps are maybe sometimes invested by landscape treatment. These are all very positive. Of course, maybe sometimes it depends on how it is conducted. It can be a little bit superestimated, such as, I don't know, the Milanese municipality is bringing, is conducting a series of interventions in the cities, in these, in say spaces, marginal spaces of the city, underused spaces of the city, through a program that is called Piazze Aperte, Open Squares. And sometimes it just consists of, say, painting on the ground, the asphalt, and some maybe a bench here, a bench there. Sometimes it seems a little bit like, of course, a demagogic instrument in the hands of municipalities, you know. But of course, it depends on the way which you apply, you separate.
Because a bit of research, these interventions in Europe are very different.
Of course.
We try to reduce that community, that's a lack of public intervention in spaces. These becomes are really powerful to people.
Exactly. In Latin America, there are plenty of interesting examples in this sense of tactic urbanism. So, yeah, the fact is also that where there is a community, this works better because actually there's someone who's going to use these spaces. So it just, that's what I was mentioning before. Sometimes you can do all the efforts in terms of space, of quality of the space, but if you don't have, say, the community who's going to use them, it's going to be very difficult to create really a place. So, yeah, you know, it's always on the edge.
There's a thing for me, it's for the lack of intervention, really complex. The success or the essence of them is that they don't come actually from us, the scientists, but from the community that has a need and that we can guide, and for that some sort of needs to rearrange that space. So, I don't know the case because it's not something I have developed much of. I think that the real issue of the real success of this month is because there is a spark of something that's the need space. And then you can actually, I don't think that you should do something, but you should like be involved in a process to accelerate
make things happen, like to orient processes.
Because sometimes, as we said before, sometimes we design good public spaces, but there is no one who uses the users of that public space is not it's not achieved that they could be, it's an argument. So it's actually a bit complex, and maybe we're going back to what we see today. For me, the ground of these interventions that are more close to the art rather than the architecture for me. It's I really find it really hard to design because as we saw the different ones, especially the one that is the huge cement poured down in
The Gibellina, Gretto.
and so it's open to debate whether of these interventions are correct or not correct, or if we like it or we don't like it. So I think that it's a simple architecture, but I don't know if it's because of the training that we have more time in architecture, like this, that I can see the logic behind one building and where it comes from, but from the landscape interventions and especially someone in particular that is really like, for example, the marks for me it's really complex to understand.
Complex to understand because it seems a formalist.
Yeah, I think the shapes of the texture of the course
Yeah.
everything is something he wants to give it. So there's also many subjectiveness, the side of him and that's artistic. Yeah, so for me it's maybe because of my school in Los Angeles we are usually trained to conceptualize a building and have another background explanation of why the building is like this. But when I design landscape, I think that that's a big challenge.
Seems to be arbitrary.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I understand what you mean, and of course it's. I know that sometimes I also think about this lecture. For example, it happens to think to me to think about over design. You know, also to say the risk of, as we were saying before, of giving all the responsibility to the design, to how something is designed instead of the process, etc. Of course, this lecture was dedicated to this very important. It was kind of meant, okay, to discover all this encroachment between art and landscape that is actually at the basis of contemporary landscape. So it exists, and it is. We can't ignore it. And of course, we have to know also its cultural, historical roots, because it's as architects, as we have a cultural, historical, cultural basis on architecture, we also have it on landscape, because it's maybe we are missing a little bit this part. But of course, we didn't talk a lot. So it's very different when you deal with Richard Long idea of the processual and ephemeral traces that are actually based on this idea of something happening. Okay, it's an artistic practice. It's artistic practice, but it deals with the process, the idea of the process, and so it can be at the basis of many practices in which the process is the basis of the intervention. And practices such as Burle Marx or others that we saw today, in which it's not about the process, but it's about the outcome. It's about sometimes it may seem to some of you maybe over design as well. Something that is charged with an aesthetical intention, very strong aesthetical intention that is not necessarily going together with the purpose, but it is also to a certain extent the self-expression of an artist, because of course it's like that. It's in architecture, in landscape, it's also like that. You say we are dealing with processes, urban processes, environmental processes, etc., but we're also dealing with an expression, self-expression that is of course always need to be located, say. Put into an historical context, or also need to be going together with a certain program, certain need, responding to certain needs, to certain programs. Of course, in landscape as much as in architecture. Of course, in architecture, maybe this is more evident because architecture is always serving a purpose. But we also have to consider that landscape is the product of design. So design is the product of a specific cultural, specific aesthetical point of view, of a specific visual, say, formal education or education to materials. And so all of this is part of landscape practice, and we can't say we should consider this. Maybe we are in a moment in which, the most interesting, the more interesting practices, maybe more successful practices are the practices which are really relying on the process, actually. So, but this would be the subject of another lecture, and again, another one. We could talk about a lot of stuff. Anyway, yeah, I understand what you mean. And that's exactly what I was saying, the indeterminacy. You also have, of course, in Madrid Rio works very well, so it is a very huge surface of public space and parks because it's a metropolitan area. There is a waterfront. It involves the presence of the river. It involves several neighborhoods around. So it is a reservoir of public space for a huge piece of the city. It's something that you cross because there is also it's also an important connection. It used to be also the place for a highway that has been put underground, but it's also the public space for different neighbors that are facing that area. So it depends. Each case is a different case, but so of course the Noguchi landscapes are landscapes for contemplation, are actually quite more works of art than landscapes themselves. But we couldn't have Peter Walker without some Noguchi, know what I mean? And so we couldn't have the pop ludic treatment of public spaces that have been a great slice of landscape production in America and also then in Europe in different decades between the 80s and the beginning of the 2000s without Isamu Noguchi and this encroaching of landscape and art practice. So we need to understand the roots of our present practice. This was the aim also. And also the aim, I guess, is exactly what you also have talked about, trying to raise a more careful observation of the materials of the surface, of the nature of the surface, also in our lives, in our projects, in general, in our action as architects, both in cultural and let's say design terms in general.
I discovered this semester, like thinking the landscape project as an art project. Because we think from architecture where you have a program to follow, you have always reasons to have everything more personal in a way. But in landscape, sometimes it's like, okay, but you have to do a certain, maybe you have to have a rule, training, but that's not the program to follow.
Yeah.
Let's say after pieces. So now that you are in studio, the next part is more small, but when you have the old part, you have more tools to say, okay, I'm going to do this because of this is all that. You have the narrative, the creation narrative.
Yeah.
But when you are working in small places, you cannot create narratives. You have to make something. And then, okay, maybe it's not about art, it's about making beautiful. The ones are good, and say why are good, one. But it's like, okay, maybe it's sometimes protecting art. And it's like, okay, but
I think that also
yeah.
want to find this concept. You know,
Because we have like studios, there's picture that's called concept. Okay.
Okay.
this pattern maybe it's not the
It's easier to find because you have more inputs. Here you have like more free.
But there's always a narrative that you can create. Let's say, okay, maybe there's not a strict program, like you have to put a bedroom in, okay, or a kitchen or whatever, or a conference room, okay. But so it's not so strict as in architecture. That's from here the arbitrariness or apparent arbitrariness of when you're dealing with the landscape as designers. But I think that. To make it successful, for a project to be successful, you should actually make always the attempt to not only to have your narrative, but also to respond to some. Eventually, say you make choices in any way, and you are having an effect on the way people are experiencing the spaces, open or closed or whatever. Maybe not because you are telling, okay, here there is a conference room, but because you are telling here there is a mall instead, and here there is a paved surface, here there is something that's bringing you from here to here, passing from here, or something that is actually asking you to step from there and creating. So, of course, you are impacting on actions, perceptions, uses, behaviors, that you will want it or not. So I agree that you need to have references, inspirations that can stem from many sources, but that you eventually, as always in architecture and in design, so that you have to make choices, you have to say in a way you have to take a position, take a seat. Say you are going toward this idea of public space or this other concept of public space, you're proposing kind of use of public space or another one, public or private, open space, whatever. So it seems to be arbitrary, but and maybe it's also linked to an artistic practice as architecture. Of course, we don't mean that architecture is not an artistic practice. Of course, it is, but it's always, and in landscape, I guess it is the same, subjected to not only to your complete free will and inspiration, as in art, art that you find in museums, but it is linked to, it is the better if you are kind of aware as an architect of what kind of impact you will have on the experience of the place, because that's the core of the fact that you are transforming this place. Transformation implies a different use, different perception, different behavior, different feeling, different way of being there, different way of being. You can be happy or unhappy according to also to how the place. Say how do you react to the place? So of course it always implies much more people saying. But of course, I understand what you mean exactly. I think it's also true to a certain extent. But we have to be careful that when we are transforming a place, we are always dealing with. We're always impacting. We are always in a way. You always have a program also in landscape. The narrative.
It's more of like.
Yeah, it's more flexible.
Because we have more open spaces in the landscape. yeah, when we construct in some buildings or something, we are more, there's some open spaces, closed spaces, but if you have more open spaces, you are more flexible. You can do more.
Yeah, also because open spaces, it's a very difficult problem because it's not, sometimes you don't have, actually the problem in our cities, for example, is that you have a lot of restrictions on public spaces, but so actually you can say that there are less restrictions on the use of public space because they are in the past, for example, for a long time, they have been public space, so actually open to everybody. And so eventually different things could happen that you maybe didn't foresee in public spaces. Nowadays, this is true until a certain extent, because of course, I don't know, if you consider many recent public spaces that are named or defined as public spaces, they are actually dedicated to a certain category of people and to a certain behavior. Certain behaviors are allowed and others are not, or certain activities are allowed and certain are not. So eventually they're flexible, but we have to say it would be really, really nice if you would have, say, so this idea of public space, of the nomadic public space that Deleuze, Guattari and praised and that I'm trying to bring in this lecture could be applied to our urban public spaces, but it's not so easy because they are always charged with a certain meaning or the commercial character or status symbol or whatever to say. So the distinction is delicate between, yeah,
like governments and what he done in the video, I think it's increased the urban regions there.
yeah.
It's government power.
For example, the Parque del Flamengo is a public park, and actually everybody can go there. Yeah, and it can be used in different manners. Of course, there is also the other way around, the upside consequences. Maybe it's very degraded in some parts. But of course, if you go to Milan and you go to the new plazas of Milan, they are private, public, private. We don't know if actually it's difficult to define them as public spaces. Although they are open spaces and they are invested by landscape intervention, water, and pavements and vegetation. But it's difficult to call them public in the widest sense of the word. So, yeah, I don't know. Semi-public, yeah. Semi-public, semi-private. Let me check if the people from home have something to say. Guys, okay, no, there are only 9, and okay, and no questions. Okay, so guys, I think that this topic has raised a lot of curiosities and debate and also different viewpoints, so it was interesting. Thank you for the comments and the insights. And so next time it will be, well, next time we'll meet is going to be the 13th online. Yeah.
Because I won't be here the last lesson. Do we have to prepare like the start of the exam, or we are going to make questions? Like if we have to prepare.
So the idea at the beginning, from the starting, was that in case you would have liked to to investigate in a more in-depth way a certain topic, maybe we could have discussed about it, and you would have collected a sort of personal bibliography on this topic, but this seems to, maybe it didn't happen, that some students asked me this. Maybe it was a little bit like, there is a lot of bibliography as well, so you will like to focus on the bibliography of the course. It's not worthy to add something else. It can happen that maybe I can ask you to begin from something that have particularly interested you, but I would not say that I would structure all this and like that. So it actually depends on you. Let's say if you have some topic that you really have liked more, that you would like to study more, etc., you could come to me and say, Professor, I like to talk a lot about this stuff, but that doesn't mean that I can do also questions about other things.
Have something to start with, so we are not.
Yeah.
This that's what it works for.
Yeah, the problem is that if you start always with the question, tipo a piacere, you know, sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to reach, to have an insight of. So, no, I wouldn't say that I will start eventually always with the possibility to start from a certain topic. Maybe I can start with the questions, because or else the exams become like 1 hour long. Because you have, you discuss, because then we are, let's say, we begin to discuss on the topic that you propose, and then before introducing the other topic, we have already 20 minutes. We spent already 20 minutes talking, so it's going to be, maybe I prefer to ask the first question. Yeah, of course, as I said, if there is something that you are really interested in, you can tell me, because it can be a topic of discussion. Okay, guys, good lunch. Let's go to eat. And thank you so much. Also to you at home that you're still here. Thank you so much. Thanks. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Mariam. See you next Monday, not the 6th, but the 13th, online. And I'll send you the recording. Okay.